Hi everybody, welcome back to my 0.16 Railworld map. My name is Poober, and one of the most recent videos I uploaded was actually the Railworld tour of this map, so if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you do so before continuing on with this video. The quickest link is in the upper right hand section over here, and that was an hour-long tour of the entire map. But this video will be a little bit different because this will actually be focusing more on my thoughts about how the base ultimately turned out. For starters, for those of you who don't remember, or for those of you who never saw the video to begin with, I did start this series with a goal in mind, but it was not 5,000 science per minute. So that is probably one of the biggest things that I would change if I could go back in time and redo it, was start to plan out a little bit of a different base shape if I knew in advance that I was planning on doing something so big as I ended up doing. This is how the base was intended to look. Obviously a lot smaller, but I basically just kept on adding octagons, and I pretty much just got a little bit too carried away. So starting with probably one of the biggest things I would change, if not the biggest thing, is actually my rail network system. As you can tell, when the base is actually really up and running with either rebuilding my science, even though I technically don't have research running right now, you can see just how congested my trains get. Now this is about as congested as it gets because this is about in the center of my base where I have a lot of train traffic coming through because I have a lot of things getting delivered in this very centrally located area. So you can see just how slow my trains are going because they have to wait for everything else to kind of finish going through before everything else can continue along the way. This could have been mitigated by having a wider train lane system. So instead of 2 lanes going into each direction, I could have had 4, which would have helped a little bit at least. But the other thing, of course, to help mitigate this would be to have a completely different layout of my train tracks to begin with. For example, instead of having my higher traffic area, like my rocket silos where I have lots of things getting delivered in the very center of the base, it might have helped to have it further out or something like that so that I could actually delegate or at least plan on where my higher traffic trains would be going and therefore guarantee I don't have as many train intersections in the higher traffic areas. The obvious result of not having enough throughput of my trains is that I therefore cannot meet my 5,000 science per minute demand. One of the more noticeably impacted factories was actually my blue and purple science, where my iron gear wheel trains or my steel trains just could not keep up with getting to where they needed to go in a timely manner because of all of the congestion throughout the base. Even if I were to add even more trains devoted to getting iron gear wheels or steel to the train stations where they needed to go, for instance, it still would have only exacerbated my problem because I'd have more trains causing more congestion along the tracks. So ultimately, the best solution would have just been to have designed a proper rail network from the very beginning, but of course, it's too late to have done that, but I do know better for my next series. The ironic thing is that even though this base will only average about 3,000 or 4,000 at most science per minute when fully up and running without anything buffered, if I had actually planned on that science per minute rate from the very beginning, I'm sure I would have ended up with a better throughput because I wouldn't have had as many trains coming throughout the system, it would have been laid out differently, and ultimately ended up being more efficient. Another big thing I would have changed if I could go back and do it all over again would be to focus more on my FPS and UPS more from day one than I did. And the reason for that is that it is only sitting about 20 FPS right now, and that is with the base partly running. But even with the base turned off, it only gets about 33, 35 FPS about max. Unfortunately, that is nowhere close to 60 FPS, which would of course be the ideal to be working with. But what that means is that it ended up making my playtime really kind of unfun, to be honest. I was much slower with my walking speed despite having my exoskeletons in my armor. The trains were slower, and therefore that was partly contributing to not being able to fully keep up with my train throughput. And of course, the factories were also much slower as a result. Again though, I never did plan on making my base quite as big as it turned out, but had I known from day one that I was going to be going this big, I would have focused more on using solar panel arrays throughout the entire base or using up my space a little bit more efficiently. Instead of using my big, massive, FPS-sucking nuclear reactor facilities, which I have 6 of these throughout the base, And other things I could have done would be to add things like more underground belts like I started to do in some of the areas throughout the base. So here's a good example of where I could have added them just to help get rid of the active sprites on the actual map. But hopefully when 0.17 drops, there should be an improvement on the overall FPS and UPS of this base. Another thing I would modify, and I'm actually very sad to say this, would be my iron and copper smelting areas. Now, if you guys remember, this is actually a Lazen's original design, although I did modify it a little bit. A couple things I changed. For one is the unloading station where I have the iron or copper ore come in and drop off the products. Now, in a Lazen's original design, he actually has a train unloading station set up for a 282 wagon. But of course, as you guys know, I run with a 242 wagon. So that means in order to still supply the car with enough iron or copper ore respectively to fill up the car by the time it gets done, like you can see here, I needed to modify that a little bit to still allow for basically 8 wagons worth to get dropped off simultaneously and then fed into the cars that make their way eventually down the rows and rows and rows till the iron plate or copper plate eventually gets back into the car and then gets unloaded. Now, as you're noticing here, I'm having a very difficult time actually maintaining with that throughput. Basically, in order to make sure that we get full iron or copper plate in all of the cars by the time it reaches the end of the line here, when the base is actually fully up and running, I do have to maintain pretty much non-stop iron or copper ore trains coming in, and I'm just not doing that. And part of it is that it's just really hard to farm that much anyway to maintain 5,000 science per minute. But secondly, as we have already talked about, it's just really hard to maintain the throughput of the trains anyway because of how the rail system is set up. As a result of the cars not getting fully stacked with iron or copper ore by the time it makes its way down to the end of the unloading station here, as is the case when the base is actually more up and running than it is now, I end up noticing that these furnaces near the beginning of the lines end up producing a lot more, while the furnaces towards the end of the line end up producing far fewer products, while furnaces over here to the beginning have produced over 1 million products. What that is telling me is that basically not enough ore is getting to the end of the production line, and we're therefore not using the factory to its full potential. Ideally, this factory should be producing 77,000 iron or copper plate per minute, but I would have to guess that I'm doing maybe 3/4 of that, which is definitely not ideal when I've been going for such a high science per minute as I have been. The consequences of not having a fully 100% working smelting factory is most notable here in the iron or copper plate loading area that go into these wagons here eventually. Now what I mean by that is that ideally by the time the car finally rounds its last corner here, it should be 100% full like we see here because it's basically buffered at this point. But when there is definitely more demand for iron plate, or copper plate for that matter, when the base is more turned on, these cars might only be half full or maybe 3/4 full. But as a result, that means that these cars here that do the unloading here at the very beginning of the line end up being able to drop off a lot more products than these cars over here towards the end because there's just not nearly enough products to pull from. As a result, these wagons here towards the end will hardly get any products, if any at all. So you might notice only 3 wagons, maybe even 2 wagons getting products, and then therefore leaving the station, and as a result just not supplying the factories like they should be. Now this is a problem more to do with my own limitations with being able to keep up with my iron ore throughput rather than a Lazen's actual design. I'm sure that if I weren't actually going for such a high goal of 5,000 science per minute and doing something a little bit more modest, maybe even like 2,000 or 3,000 science per minute, this would be able to keep up with it a lot more easily, and therefore we'd be able to ensure more even distribution of the iron plate or copper plate into the wagons here. But with my circumstances, it's just not quite the case. Well, I've spent the first 10 minutes or so of this video kind of critiquing my own base, but I do want to add in a couple things I do appreciate and like about it. Don't get me wrong, I'm actually very proud of myself. I definitely challenged myself with a goal I've never even remotely attempted before. The closest I've ever even gotten comparatively would be my 1,000 science per minute base, which is really hardly any comparison at all. This is the first base where I've really tried anything quite so big and quite with this scale and of course with this type of shape. One thing I am especially proud of myself for this series was the fact that I did try to have the goal of creating my own factories, whereas in my previous space I ended up kind of just copying and pasting a lot of blueprints that I found or was inspired by for other Factorio players. But in this series I ended up designing, for the most part, all of my factories apart from the big ones being smelting, which I did not design. Like I said, that credit goes towards Alazin. And I did get inspiration from a lot of other Factorio players though in the creation of my own designs as well, including Rackfallon for the actual rail track network that you've seen around the base, and then Eladris, for example, for the Kovarex enrichment process, and so many others that I can't even think of off the top of my head that ultimately either inspired parts of my factories or contributed portions of their designs into my end design that I came up with. The factories I am most proud of myself for though are my science factories, which I pretty much just kind of started from scratch on and worked on and are 100% my own design. I wanted them to look aesthetically pleasing and be as symmetrical as possible, and I'm really proud of how I was able to achieve that. Furthermore, I'm really proud of all of the stuff I've learned and was able to implement with my circuitry and train networking. Never in a million years did I think before starting this series that I would be able to learn how to hook up my train signaling like I did here to allow train stations to turn on and off dependent on different signals and such like that, which I had never played with before. I was also able to play with, for the first time, some different belt balancing techniques with the use of circuitry, which I also had never played with before. So really, I've learned a lot. If anything, this base and playing it has been a really great learning experience, which I hope to take those experiences and apply them into my next base and make it even better. But I do still think I was able to accomplish making the base as beautiful as I possibly could with what I had to work with. I do think it turned out really good despite some of its shortcomings. There's still definitely ways to improve upon it, but that is what I am leaving up to you guys. So please let me know if you are able to make any changes or modifications or what you're able to do aesthetically with it. I would love to see that. Just feel free to reach out to me, like I said, on either Discord or YouTube, and I would love to hear from you. But for now, this is Pooper signing off, and I will see you guys soon.